Okay, so this is the audio for Chapter 8, Identities and Inequalities, Inequalities in Health and Illness. So like everything else we've discussed from a sociological lens, a lot of things in our culture are socially constructed, and health and illness are no different. So there's a construction of what's considered healthy and sick. So healthy and sick are not simply objective physical standards that are found universally, but they're social creations. And these vary between groups and within groups, and you see how they change over time. So conditions that are considered problematic or life-threatening in one culture might be considered normal in another culture. So my favorite example, probably in the history of teaching, or in any of the classes that I teach, is the Coro example. Fascinating. Talk about anthropological or overlapping sociological interests. Just fascinating. The Coro example and how it shows how health is socially constructed. So in Malaysia, a man may be diagnosed with Coro, which is a sudden intense anxiety that his sexual organs will recede into his body, causing death somehow, I guess. So it doesn't matter that that illness is not real. People fall victim to it because the social perception is that it is real. Again, fascinating, right? So again, moving back to our own cultural constructions of health. So we tend to see, at least in the United States, we tend to see bodies as machines that require basic checkups for routine maintenance, right? So when you go to your doctor, you're just getting, the maintenance or your body service as you would your car, right? So diseases are considered enemies that need to be destroyed, right, or conquered. So as a result, doctors here are more likely to take aggressive approaches to treatment than their colleagues in European countries, largely because of the social understandings of the diseases themselves. Also, in this country, when it comes to women's health, we're so focused on breast cancer that many women end up having mastectomies when they're unnecessary in fear that they will die otherwise. I actually posted this video here for you about that for more information, which I would clip into this audio, but every time I seem to do that or add videos, I get copyright infringement stuff on YouTube, so let's not do that. What I'll do is give you a second here to pause this, click on the actual PowerPoint, and click on that link so you can watch that video real quick. So I will give you that moment. All right, moving on. The sick role. So these are the expectations of how someone will behave when they're sick, and this is found in each culture. So it often involves being exempted from normal responsibilities. So different cultures define the sick role differently. So there's expectations of your actions, including taking action towards getting better. So I have an example of that. I have a coworker at the library that she's great. She's a wonderful human person, but it's the problem is that she's always sick, and it's because she refuses to take care of herself, right? So basically week after week after week, I work there once a week, and every week I go in and she's battling something, right? So at some point you can't feel bad for someone once, they just don't take care of themselves. So it becomes this thing of the sick role itself has expectations, right? You expect okay, well, if you're sick, stay home, take care of yourself, get better, and ever not be sick, right? So the definition itself varies considerably along social class and gender lines within the same culture. So in the 19th century, being sick was acceptable for middle class or wealthy women who had things like fainting couches, right? Which poor women were considered hardier and more resilient than the dainty wealthy. When in reality, poor women got sick, especially so because of their work and their lifestyles, but they didn't have the luxury to miss work. As a result of their social class or their social role in the culture, they were unable to get those sick role privileges. So it's interesting, right? There's this kind of cultural conception that the poor are somehow hardier, right? And that really is just a reflection of the unequal treatment or the, inaccessible options for healthcare and for basically taking a day off, right, that the poor face. So even giving birth didn't warrant time off for poor women. They were expected to go right back to work. So it's interesting to see how obviously we have these cultural problems today, but they're not new, right? These kind of social divisions and hierarchical natures of, the way that we divide society affects the way that we understand health. So, people's physical appearance often reflects their level of economic comfort. So this is interesting because the rich are able to use their resources to preserve and protect their health. So if you look at someone like Rob Lowe or Paul Rudd, it's as if they're vampires, right? Or Jennifer Aniston, or if you saw J-Lo, right, at the Super Bowl. But it is their wealth, right, that affects that youthful looking appearance, right? It's their eating, their workouts, they have skincare regimens, right? And as a culture, we're all locked into this fear of aging, right? Where we want to aspire to this privilege. So we buy a bunch of crap to try to preserve our bodies too. But of course, without having the dietitian and the personal chef and, all these people, basically an army of people working on improving your particular body and health, we just don't have that opportunity to preserve ourselves in that way. So it's interesting. Also, when it comes to the overlapping of social class and health disparities, the cycle of poverty also affects the generation of physical handicaps. So meaning, this is particularly a problem for the working poor, meaning the more marginalized you are, the more difficult it is to be socially accepted. So as a poor person, your parents can't afford to get braces or really often dental care at all, right? So you're going to lose some prominent teeth. And then that affects the way employers see potential applicants, making it much harder for them when they do secure or when they get a job application or a job interview. It's harder for them to get that job. And when they do get employed, medical is often not offered for low-wage labor. So the problems get worse, right? So if you think about those things that are taken for granted in middle-class or wealthier households, right, of braces or any of these kind of things to improve your adult appearance over time, that's just not accessible to everybody. So as a result, we judge people and their worthiness based on their attractiveness. And I mean, I could get into Disney movies all day and how they train us to do that, but that's something we learn from a young age, and it's something that we apply throughout our entire socialization. So the marks that are left on our bodies by social inequalities may come from day-to-day physical tolls, right? Meaning, if you have economic insecurity, you might be working a lot, or you might not be eating enough, or you might be eating too much unhealthy food as the result of living in a food desert or other related factors, right? So hunger is a big part of this understanding. Well, actually, we have a very flawed understanding of hunger in our culture, right? We are in a country with an obesity crisis. So a lot of people focus on their weight, but they don't think about those people that don't have access to food or live with food insecurity. So when most Americans hear the word hunger, they think of those kids in the commercials, right, that are starving in Africa. They rarely think about those in their own country who are struggling to get enough to eat every day, for themselves and for their kids oftentimes. A common misconception is that there's not enough food to feed everyone in the world because of droughts and soil erosion, which of course may be a factor more nowadays thanks to global warming. But in our country, we throw away about 40% of the produce that we grow, often because it looks weird. So politics and economics also play a role, as many developing countries export huge amounts of food while millions in their countries are starving or malnourished. So when the countries attempt to modernize, they spend so much of their industrialization, and that's because that's where the kind of financial incentives are, right? From multinational corporations, that's what they're trying to get them to do. So this often affects the incentives for rural farmers to grow things, right? So when they receive very little compensation. So one example of this could be, the former NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that, opened up trade within the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And so what this did was, through NAFTA, unfortunately, in the U.S., we subsidize a lot of our food markets, and people don't understand this. So meaning we subsidize corn. We pay farmers not to grow corn, right? So that we can inflate the price of corn. And so what's fascinating is, let's say you have government subsidized corn. So you're able to basically incur less cost in growing corn so you can sell it for cheaper, right? Versus you're trading in the same market as someone that's an indigenous farmer, right? Or someone who, let's say, for 3 or 4 generations, their family has been growing corn in Mexico, right? And so the corn that they sell is developed from, a very kind of slow process of, generation after generation kind of forming it towards the most, prolific corn that they can grow, right? So what happens is, that farmer has to sell their corn for $1 an ear in order to pay back for the seeds themselves, for, being able, the cost of planting, the cost of harvest, all of these kind of things, right? And so if they have to sell their corn for $1 and you go to the store and there's some corn that's $1 or there's some corn that's 33 cents, which one are you going to buy? I mean, for me, I'm going to buy 3 of the 33-cent ones, right? Because of that idea. So this is how that North American Free Trade Agreement completely devastated rural farmers. And as a result, a lot of people ended up emigrating, right? Either trying to, basically leave the country for another way of life because they couldn't sustain themselves anymore, right? So it's pretty interesting how politics and economics really play a role in the way that these, either health trends or other issues develop around the world. So much of our modern era is tied to the issues of globalization, right? Or the exploitation of countries, of individuals, of the working class by transnational corporations, right? So even though we think these issues are kind of far away from us, not affecting Americans, approximately 14% of American households are food insecure, meaning they don't have enough to eat, and they often rely on emergency food from food banks. So this is, very problematic because the way that we even conceptualize or understand hunger is flawed within our culture, right? But obesity becomes our focus. So while we ignore food insecurity, we do now acknowledge obesity is a public health epidemic, right? And this is related to a lot of health issues, meaning if you have, if you're obese, then that has relationships with heart disease, diabetes, and those problems are found in high rates across the United States. But the interpersonal and economic consequences of being overweight can be just as devastating as the health effects. So stay with me for a second here. We have these stereotypes about the obese, right? That they're lazy, they have no willpower, they're self-indulgent, that, they're very, basically almost that the overweight are offensive or morally or socially bankrupt, right? So this leads to significant discrimination against the obese, especially in economic terms, right? Especially in hiring, in placement, compensation, promotion, right? And really who gets promoted and who gets fired. So this is especially true in sales jobs, where obese men and women are not considered as competent. And so employers fear that they're going to project a negative image of the company, right? So an example of that I remember offhand is when I had to stop shopping at ModCloth, which I used to love ModCloth. It's all about getting some blouses for work, man. But the CEO of ModCloth, for a minute there, he got rid of all plus size models because he said they weren't aspirational. Right? And it's like, that's interesting. In America, where the average dress size for women is technically plus size, that means that it's not abnormal, right? So this idea of being aspirational, he's basically trying to say, unless someone looks like what you can't be, we don't want to promote that image. So, or just doesn't reflect what a lot of people actually are, right? Because for me personally, I don't know about you, but when I buy clothes, if I'm buying it online, I kind of want it to look like, I want it to be on a body that's similar to my body so I know how it'll look, right? But anyway, that guy's a jerk. So anyway, it is interesting though when you think about what kind of jobs, right, that people will either get sorted into or, like if you're going to be the kind of the face that people see when they walk into a company, or if you're working at a serving job or something like that, that a lot of people that are obese just don't get those opportunities because of these assumptions that they can't hustle, which is so unfair. Actually, I remember this girl I knew in grad school that she was actually getting her grad degree in psychology, but we had a couple classes together. And she had this condition, this genetic condition, which I have a genetic mutation. So I was like, yay, we're friends for life. So anyway, she had this genetic condition that caused her to retain a lot of weight. And so it's a verified disability, and she parks in the disabled section. And she told me about some of the horrific things people would yell at her at Cal State Fullerton as she'd get out of her disabled parking spot about how, being fat is a disability, and, all of these horrific things when people don't know. You don't know why that person has a placard for their disability. It's none of your damn business to get in someone's face about it. But she would get harassed every day at Cal State Fullerton. She'd get snide remarks. She'd get looked at terribly. You know what I mean? People would treat her like crap because this idea that it's okay to look down on people that are obese, right? And really just that if someone has an actual verified medical condition that leads to that, you don't know that, right? Everyone's bodies are different. So we set a societal standard of what it should, quote unquote, should be, but a lot of what it, quote unquote, should be is really motivated by marketing, right? What makes you buy the most stuff? That's the body they're going to promote. So these Western images of thinness spread a lot of stigma against the overweight around the world. So in different cultures, they have different ways of understanding weight. Some cultures associate thickness with fertility, right? As images of thinness promoted in the media are so extreme that it's actually really interesting. If you're restricting your calories quite a bit, right, dieting to achieve the kind of body that is promoted in our culture, some women take it to such an extreme, they actually end up like they'll stop menstruating because they're taking in so little calories, right? Which is horrific. And so what's interesting about that is that what do you lose in that time period? Like, what do you lose while you're dieting? Well, your mind, partially because you're not taking enough calories to have full brain power. Another fascinating thing you lose is your sex drive. So it's ironic we equate these images with beauty, with sexiness, right? But if you actually crash diet your way or, starve your way into these types of bodies, it's actually your sex drive that takes a hit. So it's super ironic. But anyway, so research in the chapter mentioned the effect Western media had on specific cultures once they were exposed to images of thinness, and just how detrimental the messages in our media that we take for granted can really be when people try to interpret it into their own bodies. And so we can see in different eras in the US, there was also very different ideas about what body types were desirable, meaning obviously we know, like Victorian era, to be plump was to be healthy. But it's interesting how what it means to be healthy is often what it means to be exclusionary, meaning what it means to be wealthy, right? So in a time period like the Victorian era where there was large-scale food insecurity, it makes sense that if you're plump enough to have readily available food, you're considered healthy. In this time period when a lot of people that are low income, they only have access to very unhealthy foods, meaning fast food or, high starch, high fat, high sugar kinds of foods, very processed foods. And so as a result, that can lead to obesity. So it's fascinating that the body type that's very promoted today is the one that you have to basically, again, have a dietitian, have, all of these things worked out. All of these, that personal chef to give you that kind of body. And again, some people just have that kind of body genetically, right? Everyone has different bodies genetically. But the idea is that, we basically idealize what is the most reflective of wealth or something that only wealth can achieve, right? So health and privilege are another part of this, right? Poverty and obesity have an interesting relationship. So this has much to do with who's privileged, right? Back when we had a preference for thicker bodies, again, that was when people were not able to, get food. So getting food was healthier, right? So what we have today are these things called food deserts. Like, I don't know if you've ever gone into a 7-Eleven and tried to eat healthy food, which I have. It's pretty damn impossible. Like, literally, the place I used to live in was a food desert in West Anaheim. And, there were like 4 7-Elevens within a, couple blocks of us, but there was no grocery stores. And so I remember, I'd go to work, walk over to 7-Eleven, try and get something for lunch or, for my break. And I could basically get like a thing of like raw almonds and like a banana. That's basically all I could get. Everything else is processed, packaged, even those things that pretend to be healthy or not healthy, right? If you've ever had one of those like naked juices or any of those fake smoothie juice things, if you look at the amount of sugar in them, it's fascinating. One of those naked juices has the same amount of sugar as 2 Krispy Kreme donuts. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather have the 2 Krispy Kreme donuts if I'm going to take in that much sugar, right? So anyway, it's fascinating. Like, I've walked through these kind of convenience stores trying desperately. By the way, there's already a markup. It's already more expensive than it would be in a grocery store, which is ironic to do in poor neighborhoods. I mean, in a cruel way. But also just the amount of sodium, the amount of sugar, all of these, the processed foods that are there. It makes it very difficult for the poor to actually have access to things that are healthy, right? And if what you can afford is fast food, right? Versus, I remember once for my partner's birthday that I took him to this place. It was like really fancy restaurant. And I mean, I had to save up for months to go there. It cost me like bank, but it was incredibly healthy, like a farm to table. Everything's organic, all this kind of fun stuff. And it really made me think about how that was like, I paid more for that meal than I paid for like that month in groceries or fast food or anything else I was eating. And how if I could have actually afforded to eat that well all the time, I couldn't imagine how different my health would be, right? So, or if you've ever tried to like do juicing or anything like that, which I've unfortunately tried to do many times. I love juicing, but it's expensive. I mean, even just produce, you want organic produce. It adds up very quickly. So if you have wealth, you have the ability, you have the access, right? You're able to get the best foods. You're able to make sure that you have, and again, going back to what I said before, personal trainers, dietitians, right? A personal chef, someone that's going to cook the food for you when you need it. I still can never get it out of my head. There's this interview with Chris, oh Jesus, how am I going to forget it right now? He was in Guardians of the Galaxy and Jurassic Park and all that. Chris Pratt, there we go, brain. Anyway, Chris Pratt. I remember I watched some interview he was in, and he was talking about how he ate to transform his body into like Jurassic Park and away from Parks and Rec. And everything he described was basically an eating disorder. It's fascinating to me. It was like he had to eat every X amount of hours. He had to eat this or that. And one of the medical criteria of an eating disorder is obsessive thoughts for food, which is something that he readily admitted to, that he would think constantly about when he got to eat again. So it's interesting, like, even when you talk about the people that we put up as what we should look like, I mean, obviously in the culture, there's a lot of, expectations on women and their bodies, but men are also, there's a lot more pressure happening towards them as far as looking like, these Hollywood box office folks, these like kind of CrossFit miracles, right? But it's not sustainable, right? At all. And so when you create an ideal that's not sustainable, people really, basically sacrifice to try to get themselves to that level that's really just not accessible to most of us, right? So it's interesting that you don't have that personal trainer, you don't have that dietitian or that chef or anyone, or just basically a schedule where you can just work out all day for months to get ready for a film. Most of us can't do that, right? Most people have, work, school, family, kids, things going on that they don't have that kind of resource in their life. And if they're poor and they're working multiple jobs and they have more conflicts or issues of just trying to, keep yourself fed, keep a roof over your head, those things are obviously going to complicate the situation even more, right? So the association between obesity, class, and race is also itself tinged with prejudice, right? So the stigma of fat tends to combine with the stigma of poverty and non-whiteness. So the intersection they discussed in the chapter was race, class, gender, and weight. So although obesity is an issue for men and women, women are judged by a very specific beauty standard that expects a thigh gap, right? No cellulite. So women often feel the pressure to alter their weight in order to fit societal expectations. And so overall, women are more likely to be dissatisfied with their bodies. And this is something related to families. So research in the chapter showed that mothers were 3 times as likely to note excess weight in their daughters than in their sons. So we get this bias not just from peers, not just from the media, but from the people that are the closest to us, right? And oftentimes our families. So weight concern is deeply ingrained in American women, though it's not experienced equally among different women. So while over 80% of African American women and 74% of Latinas are overweight, and while 57% of white women are overweight, white women often feel more compelled to be concerned by their weight and more likely to develop eating disorders, though some do dispute this now, as we can see binge eating, overeating, and other disordered eating as eating disorders now, right? So in the chapter, they talked about this concept. It's not how you feel, it's how you look. So for many years around the world, people have caused themselves serious injury in their attempt to conform their bodies to societal expectations. So, I mean, the most extreme or just most kind of notable, example is in China, where many young women had their feet bound in order to be more beautiful, right? If you're not sure exactly how this works, I mean, it's horrifying. Just think about your foot, about bending your toes under, breaking those toes, and then basically forcing them under your foot, and basically binding your foot by trying to, fold it in half. So it ends up being about half the size that it is, and also deformed, meaning you cannot walk on a bound foot. Or if you can, it's very little walking, right, before extreme medical hazardous. So the idea was it was because women were considered more feminine if they had smaller feet, right? Smaller shoes were considered more feminine. So it's interesting how that cultural notion is still kind of floating out there, though feet binding is not socially acceptable anymore, right? But more recently, women in China have undergone surgeries to have their legs extended, meaning to make themselves taller, right? Because the standards of beauty are very Western standards. And so those tend to be of taller women. So they will basically put metal pins and screws into their leg bones that are then stretched daily, right? And so, of course, a lot of people are disfigured through this process and lose the ability to walk. Why? So they can be more beautiful, right? So this is, of course, not just around the world. It's in the U.S. And we have a lot of body care maintenance in the U.S. So in the U.S., women used to wear corsets, right, that had all sorts of negative health consequences, such as fainting or displacing your internal organs, which is so messed up. So think about prolapse, meaning, this is horrific, but this is the history, that some corsets were so tight that a woman's uterus would prolapse, meaning pop out of her body. So, and you can Google this. This is horrifying. It'll probably lead you down a terrible rabbit hole, but you can Google it. There were literally these devices women would wear, almost like a garter belt-ish thing that would like hook into your vagina and hold all your insides inside, which is all sorts of messed up, right? But thankfully, we're so woke today that we don't do this. Just kidding. We're actually now in like a new renaissance of this, except for now we don't call them corsets, we call them waist trainers, right? Or body shapers, or all sorts of, fun stuff sold by the Kardashians, right? So women will, basically squeeze and displace their internal organs in order to look thinner, to have, more curves or whatever it might be. So, I mean, obviously women are expected to rip out their facial hair, their body hair, wear spine-altering heels, glue on fake nails and fake lashes, and again, often limit their caloric intake to such low levels that actually become dangerous to them and to their health. Why? To be beautiful. So research in the chapter also looks at, again, how attractiveness affects your employability, meaning those that are considered attractive are more likely to be employed, and they often make about 6 to 8% more than their perceived unattractive coworkers. So this is something that, affects, it's not just about the beauty, it's about the health, but it's also about the social status and kind of value systems we place around it. Also, physical appearance is big business. So even when the economy is bad, people spend a ton of money on beauty products, such as makeup, skincare products, beauty parlors, and of course, plastic surgery, right? Including non-surgical procedures like Botox and chemical peels, which are incredibly popular and profitable, or, like lash extensions, any of that kind of crap. With women being over 90% of patients for procedures that are surgical or non-surgical when it comes to cosmetic surgery. So while these issues seem to focus on more white, middle class, or affluent communities, it's really an issue for many groups of women. So Asian American women are more likely than any other ethno-racial group to pursue cosmetic surgery. What kind of surgeries women get are often connected to race ethnicity. So white women are most likely to get breast implants or liposuction. African American women get more nose jobs and lip surgeries. And Asian American women often get eyelid surgeries, meaning putting a crease in an eyelid to kind of fit this Western ideal or preference for rounded eyes. So you can see how What kills me about this is, yeah, someone wants to spend some money to quote unquote improve themselves, let them. That's what people say, right? But my whole thing is, why would you feel lacking in the first place? Like, if you're an African American woman, why would you feel like you have to change your nose or your lips? Well, because of the culture. If you're an Asian American woman, why would you feel like you need an eye crease in your eyelid? Because of the culture, right? Or even for white women, like, why would you feel like you need bigger breasts, right? Same deal. Liposuction, same deal. Because of the way that women are portrayed in the culture and the expectations we have to meet those standards, right? So men are now facing more societal pressure to fit their bodies to beauty standards as well. So male grooming has also kind of increased, which, not completely complaining about, right? But I just remember when this kind of manscaping genesis first came up in, what was it, like the late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere in there, where they came out with this term to like stigmatize men who actually, like, I don't know, wash their ass once in a while, called, metrosexual. That, like, if you were a man who like combed his hair nice or did his hair or cared about his appearance, that somehow that affected your sexuality. So I just find that, fascinating from a social inequalities kind of point of view of how we stigmatize men. We basically expect them to look one way, but somehow just appear that way, not actually put in the effort to appear that way, because that's somehow beneath men. Why? Because it's expected for women to put in time on their appearance. So it's such a weird double bind that men are caught in, because you're supposed to look good, but you're supposed to like not try to look. It's dumb. It's like the thing where guys are like, women don't need to wear makeup. And you're like, the women they say look natural and aren't wearing makeup are wearing makeup. But anyway, so, this idea, though, more American men are now getting swept up into these expectations and really internalizing those standards in their own bodies. Meaning more of them are dieting, more of them are having weight loss surgeries or liposuction, tummy tucks, gastric bypasses, all that stuff. And so, again, that's not the equality. The equality would be we all love ourselves and are fine with our bodies and we don't have societal notions affecting our internal worth, right? But unfortunately, you can see how this is even changing in the modern era. How if it's financially profitable to make us feel insecure so that we pay to change our bodies, there's, billion-dollar industries lining up to take that money. So for those struggling to survive or get enough food to eat, the quest for bodily perfection may seem trivial or out of their grasp. But they will eventually deal with illness, and they will eventually die. So the problem is that the chance of getting sick and getting well are not equally distributed. So there's imbalances in susceptibility to illness, in access to effective health care, and this is stratified around the world, and of course in the US, right, along class, race, ethno-racial, gender, and sexual lines. So when it comes to global inequalities, according to the World Health Organization, poverty is the single greatest cause of ill health in the world today. And that's the result of billions of people living on less than $1 a day. So they don't have access to food and medicine. They often don't have access to clean water. Again, something people in industrialized societies take for granted, unless you live in Flint, Michigan, or I guess, well, technically, that report came out recently that there's, thousands of American cities that are dealing with some sort of non-access to clean water, especially in poor communities. But anywho, so that idea that, the things that are taken for granted in wealthier places, again, living on less than $1 a day, that's just going to set you up for, if you can't get healthcare, if you can't get medicine, if you can barely afford to eat, you're not going to be healthy. Another hurdle are the health services in poor countries. As poor and middle-income countries have about 80% of the world's population, they carry 90% of the world's diseases, but only account for 11% of world, healthcare spending. So millions of people die from illnesses that could have been prevented or treated if they lived in a wealthier country or had access to more medical care. So when it comes to the effect of HIV/AIDS, this is the most troubling global imbalance, with the majority of cases coming from sub-Saharan Africa. The effect it has on life expectancy is staggering. In the US and Europe, the life expectancy is about 80 years. But in places affected by the AIDS crisis, life expectancy is about 40 years, or half that. So it's also becoming a feminized epidemic, meaning more and more women are being infected, and at younger ages. So in sub-Saharan Africa, women between the ages of 15 and 24 make up 75% of new cases. Some of this is an issue of gender imbalance, where women do not get to make decisions about sex, especially they are not given access to contraceptives or birth control. Also, being poor can force women into transactional sex or sex for money, which often leaves them at risk. And when it comes to poor women's health around the world, poor women face persistent and pervasive health risks beyond AIDS, as they occupy subordinate statuses and face economic hardships that hit them, and their kids hard. Wealthier women are 4 times more likely to have access to contraceptives and 5 times more likely to have their child in the presence of a medically trained assistant, versus the risk of, women dying in childbirth is 300 times higher in the developing world. Over half of women who die giving birth are African. And for every one African woman who dies, 20 others experience debilitating complications from childbirth. Children of poor mothers are also 3 times more likely to be stunted in their growth and are twice as likely to die than kids born to wealthier mothers. So we can see the impacts there. So this is influenced by global economics and politics. Wealthy countries can afford vaccines. They can spray for mosquitoes. They can purify their water. But wealthy countries do not provide these kinds of resources to poor countries. So getting back to wealth and health in the U.S., there are more than disparities between countries. There's also the disparity within our country. So poor people's living and working conditions set them up for bad health outcomes. This is even more pronounced for poor people of color. And poor children have much higher lead concentrations in their blood. And many poor people themselves work in fields that are sprayed with pesticides, or industries filled with industrial chemicals, or live near dumps or other hazardous waste sites. And so illness and poverty interact in ways that are especially dangerous to children. The intersection they used in the chapter was talking about race, class, and social vulnerability in the context of the storm Katrina, which, the storm itself and its aftermath did not affect people equally. The neighborhoods that were flooded and were left for days without organizational help were poor neighborhoods. Many did not have a car or other vehicle to flee the flooding, right? So the rich can flee, they can get away. The poor don't have access. How can they leave? So the social vulnerability of poor citizens of color continued after the storm stopped. Many were displaced, many were not able to go home, and were priced out of new developments once things were rebuilt again. So this has a lot to do with, the color of health, meaning minorities are facing long-term disadvantages in health and healthcare. They don't receive the same quality of care as white Americans, right? So one example of this that happened, a couple years ago, that made my blood boil was the example of Serena Williams, right? Where when she gave birth, and of course I take it very personally because I also have a similar condition that she has, right? Where she has developed a pulmonary embolism before, right? And so as a result, when she gave birth, she told them, I think I'm having another pulmonary embolism, which a lot of people don't live from, right? Just me and Serena Williams. But anyway, so, we're old pals. But anyway, in my head. But so basically what happened was she told them, like, hey, I need a Levinox injection, which is pretty specific, right? To know the specific medication you need. And they treated her like she was being belligerent, even though she was telling them, I'm having these symptoms that are consistent with this. And when you're high risk for blood clots, pregnancy is often a risk factor. Right? So what happened was they made her wait for hours, which could have been fatal, and then eventually ran the test that she asked for, and they found out, yes, she did have a pulmonary embolism. And then they gave her the treatment that she had asked for hours earlier, right? So when you think about that, not only was she completely knowledgeable about her condition and about her body, but they weren't listening to her, right? And so this is something that happens to a lot of women in healthcare situations, but especially women of color. But it's fascinating to see someone like Serena, who is like a household name. She's incredibly famous. She's like one of the most prolific athletes of all time, right? So if she can't get acknowledged and can't get respect in that medical setting, then what hope does anyone else have, right? So patients of color are much more likely to receive less sophisticated treatments. So in the chapter, they were talking about how when it comes to medical interventions, people of color are much more likely to get radical things like amputations of legs or arms instead of more conventional care. So whether the differences are conscious or institutional, people are not receiving the same care or adequate care. The green screen's another thing they talked about. So sometimes different treatment is motivated by financial concerns. So for transplants, for example, they're much more likely for whites because they can cost about $300,000. So there's this assumption that certain patients can't afford to actually, go through with the $300,000 surgery. So they're screened out of the transplant list, or what they call the green screen. So environmental discrimination is another issue. I put a video here as well, kind of outlining some of these issues that I wanted you to look at real quick. But again, I can't put it in this audio or they'll get me for copyright infringement. So please just take a second right now, pause my jaw flapping to click on the link in the PowerPoint and watch this video. All right, you watched it. So anyway, hazardous waste, landfills, less environmental regulations on reservations, all of these things means, there's stockpiles and nuclear waste often near reservations. So you think about the people that have the least amount of power in the culture, right? The indigenous. They are often facing the harshest health consequences, and they're also on the front line as, being earth protectors, water protectors, trying to actually call our attention to things like Keystone XL and other projects that are devastating wildlife and devastating, these beautiful tribal lands. When it comes to air and water pollution, people of color live in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. So they're much more likely to have sources of pollution within 2 miles of their home. And again, when it comes to things like Cancer Alley, right, where most of the petrochemical plants make the chemicals like plastics that we use, most of the people that live in those areas right around those terrible toxic plants are people of color and the poorest, right? So we can see the intersections there. So we can see how in the U.S., the poorer you are and the darker your skin, the worse health care you're going to receive. So I put this link here as well, a little bit of more information about the Tuskegee experiment. So obviously, if you're an African American and you know anything about history, then you would be distrustful of the medical institution, right? Because the experiment knowingly gave people syphilis, and it was left untreated in order to study the long-term medical effects of the disease, which did not provide knowledge or treatment. So this caused a lot more problems in the study, like for those participants that they didn't know. Meaning they basically they told them that it was going to be this health study, and they infected people with syphilis, who then infected their spouses or had children that were infected, etc. And this program went on for decades. And what's horrifying about it is, in the earliest stages of this program, they came up with an effective treatment for syphilis, and didn't give it to anyone. They didn't even tell people that they were infected. So a lot of them died from the results of the disease. And again, why? So they could study the long-term effects. Well, who did they pick? Did they pick like the wealthiest people, the wealthiest white folks? No, they picked the most marginal people they could find, right, to exploit. So power and hierarchy and all of these things also has a lot to do with, who gets exploited in these systems, who gets good healthcare and who gets, and obviously you'd be distrustful of a system that would marginalize people that horrifically, right? So the distrust is real, and this causes a lot of health risks because some people will put off getting care because, would you trust the system like this? So also the financial concerns that a lot of people know that they can't go to the doctor unless it's a life-threatening situation or an emergency. They're just going to try to power through it, right? There's also differences in health risks for men and women. So normal biological events that happen in women's lives, like menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause, have long been medicalized or pathologized, right? So we see women as biologically frail and emotionally erratic, so they're not suited for positions of authority, or so we hear, right? There's always that argument like a woman can't be president because she'll, push the red button. And it's like, it's not a red button, it's a red phone. And anyway, here's a fun fact. The notion that women are too hormonally unbalanced and irrational, it's kind of ironic. So obviously that's BS, but who is the most hormonally stable group of people? It's women post-menopause. So ironically, if you really believe, if you truly in your heart believe that the only person that should be president is someone that is, has the least emotional, I don't know how to say that right. Like the basically the most stable, biologically stable situation, that's going to be women postmenopause. So the whole argument is completely BS, and it's just they're pretending that it's about the emotionality when it's really about the hierarchy of patriarchy. It's really about ensconcing a world in which men are the ones who have power and women do not, right? So, this idea though that women are somehow an aberration, men are normal, right? As if men's genitals, if their body processes are totally normal and not weird. But women's are weird and horrific, right? This idea that women hide their tampons, that they hide their period from each other and especially from men. It's bizarre, right? Because again, it's an incredibly normal process that happens like through a large chunk of the lifetime. But again, we pathologize it. We turn it into an excuse for a lot of things. So it's really interesting how we gender a lot of our understandings of health. And so it cannot be seen any clearer, the gendering of health, than the issues of PMS, right? Premenstrual syndrome. So this is an issue a lot of women face, which, can be varied in how people experience it, right? So it can cause muscle stiffness, cramps, backaches, headaches, trouble concentrating, dizziness, water retention, as well as emotional side effects, such as, in my own personal experience, crying at a cheesy commercial. Right? So seeing it as a medical condition is a very recent social phenomena. And a lot of it has to do with this one terrible human person in Britain who she decided to use it. Oh my God, it's amazing. To use PMS as her defense in a murder trial. And that's when it ruined it for basically everyone else. Right? So she basically tried to say, like, that's why I killed this guy, because I had PMS. And so it caused like a big media fervor. People, journalists love that kind of crap. And as a result, it kind of changed this societal understanding that it's a medical condition that could literally cause someone to murder someone else, which is obviously not the case, right? It's just you might be a little swollen and cranky, right? Which anyone will be when everything in their body swells up, doesn't feel great, right? So it's interesting how prevalent it is to have these, again, these irrational notions of women that somehow they get PMS and they just like devolve or can't control themselves, right? Another issue is the medicalization of childbirth. So until the 19th century, doctors were pretty much absent from the birthing process. It's kind of one of those things that women tend to know how to do because it's how your body works, right? So the medicalization and hospitalization of childbirth increased women's dependence on predominantly male medical profession. So little attention is paid to women's comfort and self-esteem. And she's placed in a position with her legs in the air, her genitals exposed, because that's what's more convenient for doctors. It's not what's the best to actually give birth. Meaning, think about what position would be most comfortable to give birth in. It's more of a squat or kneel, right? Why? Because that's where you can get your legs the widest. And turns out you have this thing in your midsection called your abs, and that should help you push when you're having a baby. But of course, I'm sure you've seen childbirth like dramatized in a million like fake TV stuff and films where, it's this lady laying on her back and everyone's like, push! And she's got her legs up in stirrups and all this stuff. Think about it. When you put a woman on her back in that position, you make it so that she can't use those muscles. So it makes it actually much harder for women to give birth, and they tend to tear, right? Which is a whole nother horrifying thing. So women will tear, so they give them this thing called episiotomies. Oh God, so gross. So basically think of it this way. You got your front hole, you got your back hole, right? And the idea is they cut a slash in the wall of your, your vaginal opening so that it kind of rips to the side and doesn't rip from front to back. Right? And so again, this is horrifying, but this is done all the time. Why? Because medicalization of childbirth means they want women in and out of the hospital as soon as possible so that they can charge more women to give birth in the hospital. There's a financial incentive. So they want to get women in and out of the hospital pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do is put a clip in your additional resources about this. It's from, I usually show it in class, but we're not in class. From the film The Business of Being Born, which if you took my family class, I make you watch it anyway. But anyway, so in the film, they talk about the medicalization process of trying to force a baby into a standardized time period. Meaning some women, the first baby, it takes them like 2 full days of being in labor to give birth, right? But the idea is the hospital wants that bed empty within 12 hours so they can put someone else in there. So they give you all these chemicals to try and speed up the process, right? They'll give you basically an epidural to deal with the pain, but then they give you this Pitocin, which is a fake oxytocin, to try to quicken the delivery. But that actually causes much stronger contractions and causes much, much more pain. So then you need another epidural. But then once you get the epidural, you're numb from your waist down. You can't push anymore. So they give you more Pitocin. And then all of a sudden it cuts off oxygen to the baby. And they're like, we need to do an emergency surgery and do a cesarean because of the drugs that they gave you in the first place. So I'm going to put up a clip in the additional resources that speak specifically to this from that film. It talks about how we're basically creating a medical emergency and how in recent decades, the cesarean, how many babies are born by cesarean has increased hundreds of times more than what was normal even 15, 20, 30 years ago, right? Why? Because again, there's a financial incentive to this. And it's actually really interesting in that film, Business of Being Born, they interview this doctor that talks about a study where they found that the majority of cesarean sections happen at 2 different times a day, right before the doctors get off their shift. Meaning, that you want to go home to your family for dinner at 6 p.m. So at 5 p.m. you induce that baby and cesarean section. You basically cut into someone's abdominal wall. Takes weeks to heal up. Very invasive procedure. And of course, a cesarean makes sense in a situation where there is an emergency, life-threatening situation. But the problem is that, as you'll see in that clip from Business of Being Born that I'm going to put in your additional resources, as you see in that clip, the medical problem is caused by the medical situation we have circling around childbirth, right? And really, we teach women that they can't do it themselves, that they need to go to the hospital, that they need the doctor's expertise. Well, the doctor's in there for like 10 minutes. It's really, if you have a doula or midwife or someone like that, they're equally knowledgeable. They're going to be focused specifically on you. And really, they're going to cost you way less money. But that's a whole nother thing. All right, so when it comes to the gendering of medical practice and research, because the medical system sees women's bodies as like a problem, they also may specialize in care for women, but not usually for men. So in general, it took a while to do medical research on women's bodies. Even when we're talking about medical research in general, even female rats are commonly excluded from medical studies. Or if you've ever worn a seatbelt, which I hope you have, if you're female, probably not great, right? Like for some reason, right in the middle, right across the chest there, not comfortable for some reason diagonally, right? Yeah, that's because when they created seatbelts, well, I mean, thank you, Ralph Nader, for that. But when they were developing these kind of standardized ideas of seatbelts, of course, it was all based on men's bodies. Even crash test dummies weren't women. They're only men for many, many decades. So it's actually fascinating that to deal with this problem, Congress had to pass a law in 1993 saying that women have to be included in clinical trials so they can see if drugs have any sort of different effects on women, right? Or if surgeries or diets or whatever they're researching, that they actually also have to test it on women. Because for many years, they were only testing it on men and assuming that women would have the same consequences from those same pills. So that's obviously horrific. But again, it just shows how when you default one category as the hegemony, you kind of forget that that doesn't represent everyone, right? That the prejudice comes through that. Also, when it comes to men's health, we focus on women, but we miss issues that affect men more, like heart disease, cancer, accidents, right? Liver disease, suicide, and homicide. So one kind of men's health, what we do seem to care about is erectile dysfunction, right? Which I do think is kind of just fascinating in its own way. I actually have a cousin that's a sex therapist that he has a podcast about it called Hard Conversations, obviously pun intended, where he talks about it with different, sex therapists and, health specialists about issues of men's erections and just how much emotionality is wrapped up in that, because so much of this idea of performance and manhood and all of this crap is wrapped up in, this particular representation, when a lot of it comes from pornography, these understandings or expectations that we have about male performance, right? Which is obviously not real, right? So anyway, what I also think is fascinating about just the whole erectile dysfunction thing in general is the word impotence. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be impotent? The literal translation of impotence is loss of power. So what the hell does that say, right? That's a really interesting phenomenon when you think about, what's supposed to give men or power or status in society, right? Is that if they're having any erectile dysfunction, whether from health issues or psychological issues, whatever it might be, trauma, that we consider them impotent, meaning loss of power. So again, it's fascinating how the cultural notions, the word choices, the meanings behind these things really affect and motivate people's behaviors. Also, when it comes to homosexuality and health, even talking about erectile dysfunction, we assume all of these things are heterosexual issues, right? We often forget about gay men's health. So homosexuality has long been medicalized. It's where we got the term from, right? It literally, the first time it ever came up as a term, came up in a medical text. And so it was seen as a mental disorder for most of the 20th century, as we saw in the film earlier in the class, right? Which justified all sorts of horrific medical treatments, such as, conversion or aversion therapy, where they would basically give people like a chemical or something that would make them violently ill or sick, and then force them to watch same-sex pornography. The idea being that they would connect the sickness that they're feeling because of the drugs being, like the poisons being put into their system, with their same-sex desire, right? It doesn't actually work to change someone's sexual identity, but it's pretty effective at making someone shameful of their own identity, right? So a lot of these horrible medical treatments went on for years, right? Trying to control men's sexual desires, and sometimes even to the extremes of lobotomies, right? As discussed in that film, how, because it was considered a mental disorder and a health issue, it was medicalized, and then it was justified to have that kind of treatment. So it's really interesting just to see how something like health seems very separate of sociology. It just seems like you're sick or you're well, right? But really, health has everything to do with social inequalities and social structures and the hierarchies and value systems that we imbue into the institution of health because of our social status and social inequalities.